Well, hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it is a joy to welcome you this evening to our lecture with Nancy Ross and David Howlett. Tonight, we also recognize the 40th anniversary of Section 156 and the path to women's ordination. Now, joining me today is my co-host, Peter Smith. Peter is a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. He's co-director of our annual Historic Sites Bus Tour, and he's joining us tonight from Michigan. So welcome, Peter. It's good to see you. In addition to Peter, Lexi Frazier is joining us tonight as another co-host. Lexi is a former student in the Alma Blair internship program, a STAR student, and is joining us tonight from Iowa. So welcome, Lexi. It's good to see you. I have one announcement, just one announcement, but it is an exciting one. Exciting enough for a screen share. Tonight's lecture is kicking off our spring lecture season and another series of fascinating church history topics and guest speakers. As you can see on the screen, we have a lot of history to cover this May, and we hope you will join us as we hear about the story behind the first woman baptized in French Polynesia. One week, we will explore the evolving communion traditions in the early reorganization. Another week, we'll take a look at Frederick Madison Smith's theological views in the social gospel. These three lectures are all in addition to launching a new series of storytellers called Your Story is Church History. Our first storyteller in this new series is none other than Everett Graffio, the former apostle and presiding evangelist in Community of Christ. So I'm telling you, friends, this is a series you don't want to miss. Additional details are all headed your way soon, but in the meantime, save your Thursday nights and one Wednesday in May for more Community of Christ history. Now, speaking of exciting lectures, we sure have one tonight with Nancy and David. Lexi will be dropping the schedule for today's program in the chat to give you a better idea of what you're in for tonight, or at least over the next hour. We will always look forward to your questions after every presentation, and especially tonight. So be sure to post your questions using the Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A feature and the chat are separate, so please be sure you're posting your questions in the Q&A because there's a lot of people here tonight and using the chat, which is wonderful, but we don't want to lose your questions in all of the chatter. So please take advantage of that Q&A feature. And you can post questions during the presentation. Those are the ones we'll get to first after the presentation. So joining us tonight are our guest historians, the wonderful Nancy Ross and David Howlett. Nancy is a department chair and associate professor in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences Department at Utah Tech University, where she has been teaching for 16 years. Her PhD is in art history, but her current research focuses on the history and sociology of religion. Nancy's an ordained elder in Community of Christ and also serves as pastor of the Southern Utah congregation. Welcome, Nancy.
It's good to be here.
Nancy, with Nancy is the infamous David Howlett. He is the Mellon Visiting Assistant Professor of Religion at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. David earned his BSE from the University of Central Missouri, an MA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a PhD from the University of Iowa. He's a specialist in American religions and has taught at Kenyon College, Skidmore College, and Bowdoin College. He published works that include Kirtland Temple, the biography of a shared Mormon sacred space in 2014, and he co-authored the Book of Mormonism, The Basics, in 2017. David is also one of 3 official historians for Community of Christ, and he holds the priesthood office of elder. So welcome, David, and again, welcome, Nancy. I'll hand things over to you because we are all ready to hear about RLDS women and their activism throughout the 1960s and 70s.
Excellent. Well, this is a reprise of what we did earlier, but I mean, I'm sure I've forgotten some things since we last did it as well. So this is Becoming More Aware, RLDS Feminist Activism in the 1970s. Sometimes I almost cry at ordination services, wrote Carolyn Reiser in a 1972 editorial. I look around the congregation at some of my sisters who have performed all kinds of family ministry and individual counseling, who have deep understandings of Christ's example of loving service, whose lives testify of loving service. Yet these sisters, because they are women, cannot officially serve in a church which would not exist except for their loving efforts. Reiser was not alone in making this critique. Over the course of the 1970s, feminists in her denomination created grassroots organizations to combat what Reiser termed, quote, the patriarchal legacy of our culture that permeated their local congregations. Yet Reiser and her fellow feminists did not belong to one of the many mainline Protestant denominations that were having feminist awakenings in this era. Instead, Reiser and her fellow feminists were part of Midwestern Mormon or Midwestern American Restoration denomination, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS. This is one crowd where I don't have to explain what that means. So, in the 1970s and 1980s, RLDS feminists produced an efflorescent religious feminism in their church, particularly around the contentious issue of women's ordination. In this talk, we'll focus on this era, but first give some background to it, starting with the 1830s and working our way through successive eras of RLDS feminism. So first, early days. One of the first ways in which late 19th century Latter-day Saint women advocated for change was by reminding the rest of the church that Emma had been ordained. In the Nauvoo Minute Book, which is online as part of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, references Emma's ordination, noting that Emma did not need ordination to be president of the Relief Society, because it had already happened. Mormon feminist scholar Margaret Toscano argues that Emma was ordained in both 1842 and 1843, though Lachlan Mackay argues that it happened in 1830. The Mormon women's newspaper, the Women's Exponent, which ran from 1872 to 1914, printed and reprinted the story of Emma's ordination many times. This is the Women's Exponent from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church. Beyond this early era, let's go to 1870 to 1910. The RLDS Church, reorganized in the 1850s after the 1840s Nauvoo diaspora, expanded roles for women beyond their Nauvoo-era bounds. Women in local congregations formed their own ladies' and aid societies, though some men priesthood leaders believed that such groups encouraged women to act outside of their appropriate sphere. The Saints Herald, an RLDS publication, created a Mother's Home column in 1886, written by and under the control of Marietta Walker. While Walker generally filled her column with recipes and household management advice, she also successfully advocated for women's voting rights at General Conference, later called World Conference. Late 19th century RLDS leaders and members alike lived within a religious culture alive with spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues, faith healing, and prophecy. By the 1890s, some members began to affirm women's religious authority through these charismatic gifts. In the Pacific Slope Mission of California, High Priest D.S. Mills, also, you know, he composed a few hymns, D.S. Mills ordained Emma Burton to give administrations blessings of healing to sick women. Emma Burton was, of course, also an early missionary. Outraged opponents saw this as an ordination of Burton to the priesthood. So they clearly thought this was more than just laying on of hands. They thought this was actually priesthood ordination. When Bishop E.L. Kelly asked Mills for an explanation, Mills wrote, quote, "What I have said and done in that matter was by the power of the Holy Spirit, and I can't go back on that," unquote. Apostle T.W. Smith, the supervisor of the Pacific Slope Mission, directly responded to this incident, indicating that women could not hold priesthood office, and that in a Saints Herald article. Several church members strongly reacted to Smith's prohibition. Sister E.G. Hodge, an old Nauvoo saint, and Marietta Walker's maiden name was Hodge. I don't know if this was her. I don't think so, but I mean, but this is a family name at least. Sister E.G. Hodge, an old Nauvoo saint, wrote a letter published in the Mother's Home column saying, quote, I do not like to hear them say that women cannot hold the priesthood or do this or that. Are we not all one in Christ Jesus? Unquote. The issue came up again in April 1905 when a proposed resolution at General Conference sought to obtain ordination for women working with the Zion's Religio Society, a Book of Mormon reading group for church youth. As clergy received discounted train fares, women's ordination would have had practical value. The issue was referred to the First Presidency and the Council of 12, who reported that new revelations would be required for such a break from tradition, and that in the absence of such revelations, they could not support women's ordination. Questions about women's ordination, though, would not go away. Let's now look at the 1920s and 1930s. Even as the 19th Amendment granted white women voting rights, Protestant women lobbied for equal opportunities in churches. For example, building on previous attempts, in the 1920 General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the International Association of Women Ministers, the IAWM, sent a petition to the Methodist Episcopal Church's General Conference to, quote, approve ecclesiastical equality for women, but was unsuccessful. In the 1924 General Conference, Methodist Episcopal churchwomen secured ordination as lay preachers, but not full clergy rights. A 1920 editorial in the Saints Herald, this was written by the editor of the Saints Herald, reported on ordination debates in the Presbyterian Church. Editor Sam Burgess took the occasion to comment on the prospects of women's ordination in his church, the RLDS Church. Burgess indicated that RLDS scriptures did not prohibit women from ministry, but that ordination of women would require, quote, a change in the constitution of the church, which I think he meant the Doctrine and Covenants. By the 1930s, the broader deaconess movement among mainline Protestants began a slow decline, but RLDS President F. M. Smith considered the possibility of creating such an order for the RLDS Church. In 1936, Smith stated that at a women's gathering that he was considering, quote, ordaining deaconesses to an order of Dorcas, which, while scriptural, might have been not the best name. But the order of Dorcas, at this time, some Protestant deaconesses and their supporters had begun to advocate for the full ordination of women as well. So that's the context. It's not simply, it could have meant something more than that as well. Nevertheless, while Smith confided to his protege, Garland Tickemeyer, that women would someday be ordained to the priesthood and the full priesthood, not just as deaconesses, open advocacy for women's ordination would not happen again among RLDS for the next 35 years. A generation after ordination controversies of the 19-teens and 20s, a number of mainline Protestant denominations rapidly accepted the practice. Northern and Southern Presbyterians did so in 1956 and 1965 respectively. Some Northern Methodists in 1956, some Lutherans in 1970s, and Episcopalians finally in 1976. Concurrent with the rise of second-wave feminism, activists formed small grassroots organizations in a number of denominations to advocate for the ordination of women. That's certainly the case in the Episcopal Church. Some women from these smaller groups joined larger ecumenical organizations like the IAWM, the International Association of Women Ministers, and Church Women United, this what the symbol is right here, CWU, that engage in advocacy work. As these mainline Protestant institutions centered churches, as these mainline institutions centered churches moved to ordain women, the RLDS Church engaged in the process of discerning women's ordination too. So finally into the 70s. In April 1970, a handful of liberal RLDS faculty members at RLDS church-owned Graceland College, now of course Graceland University, founded Courage, a journal of history, thought, and action. That same month, delegates at the World Conference, the renamed General Conference, discussed a resolution that addressed women's underrepresentation on church committees. The Australian delegation presented an alternative motion that affirmed women's leadership and asked church leadership to clarify its position on women's ordination. And that resulted in a big murmur from the crowd when that happened. Delegates, however, voted to table the resolution. In a Courage editorial later that year, the board identified two significant problems in the church: women's inequality and, quote, a shortage of priesthood manpower, unquote. Others expressed concern that the full talent of the church was not being employed due to the male-only priesthood. Another advocate, Carolyn Reiser, who we quoted in the very first part of this presentation, posed the question, quote, why do women want to be in the priesthood? And noted, quote, some women involved in the emerging women's rights movement within the church would answer, we don't. She explained that some women associated the priesthood with authoritarianism and therefore didn't wish to join it. This is also true of some Catholic women. Some advocated for women's ordination and some didn't. These are feminists too. During the 1970s and early 1980s, women's ordination was a frequent topic of debate at World Conference. Church leadership continued to state that the barriers to women's ordination were not theological, but, in the words of one First Presidency member, quote, a matter of sociology and tradition, unquote. A more conservative faction disagreed, arguing that male-only priesthood was theologically necessary. RLDS fundamentalist Richard Price, self-styled fundamentalist, for instance, published Saints at the Crossroads in 1974, which warned readers about women's ordination. He felt it was coming in the RLDS Church. Even as conservative RLDS members feared women's ordination, some feminist members left the RLDS Church because progress was too slow. AWARE, a group with a name. AWARE was a long-lived RLDS feminist group that engaged in both consciousness raising and advocacy. It began in the mid-1970s and ceased meeting in the late 1990s. When it began in the mid-1970s, AWARE was initially known as the Group Without a Name, perhaps a nod to Betty Friedan's description of, quote, the problem that has no name in The Feminine Mystique from 1963. Lois Braby, who helped found a faculty feminist consciousness-raising group at Graceland in 1969, was a supporter of AWARE. She reflected that, quote, several of us were concerned about the lack of power roles in the RLDS Church. We began to take the initiative and make open attempts to change the system, unquote. Throughout its existence, the women of the Group Without a Name drafted and redrafted statements of purpose for their group, doing so through a consensus-seeking process, common among other feminist consciousness-raising groups in the U.S. One statement from the early 1980s stated that the then renamed AWARE was to, quote, be a network of support by sharing our pain, anger, hope, and joy through worship and celebration. 2, to explore theology, our common feminist heritage, and current issues. 3, to raise our consciousness of our own behavior and encourage growth in ourselves. 4, to develop a power base for action on feminist and/or social issues. 5, to create shared leadership and responsibility. Another statement from the same era emphasized that the group had, quote, no structural hierarchy, but engaged in a free-flowing process with shared and changing responsibilities within the group. And this, I guess you could probably read the cartoon below that. So it was talking about women's ordination. That was from an AWARE newsletter. The group itself came into existence through the work of two recent college graduates, Marilou Goodyear and Joni Shoemaker, who had both participated in a Graceland College student consciousness-raising group. In the summer of 1975, Goodyear and Shoemaker sent out invitations to 35 women for a meeting at Goodyear's parents' home in Independence, Missouri. On July 12, 1975, 19 women met together for 6 hours to discuss a proposed letter to the Joint High Council, the highest leadership group in the RLDS Church. In a recent oral history, Marilou Goodyear speculated that her mother, Imogen Goodyear, and RLDS Church archivist Madeline Brunson drafted the document, though she could not be sure. The proposed letter opened with the following lines. Quote, "This letter is written on behalf of all the women in the church who, by virtue of their sex, have been indiscriminately omitted from full participation within the church structure. We write not to ask that another study committee, minor appointment, or token slot be filled by one of the many qualified women church members, but that a true revision in structure take place so that no one who is recognized as qualified and willing to perform tasks be overlooked for a biological reason. We call the church into accountability for its stance on the personhood of all souls. God has always desired to work with an individual in any manner in which that person is willing and potentially qualified. If the church is truly to become a representative world council, it must not countenance a hierarchy which is exclusively white, male, and middle class. In order to truly become a community of believers, women, non-white, poor, and rich must be allowed to function in all phases of church life: pastoral care positions, outreach growth functions, positions of authority, etc. The letter continued by referencing scripture from Doctrine and Covenants 119.8b, given in the Kirtland Temple, by the way. 119.8b, which begins with "all are called," and section 151.9a, which references the worth of all persons. It ended with a charge to, quote, "Join with us in realizing the limitations of your social conditioning and ours, and help us emerge into a new stage in history. We wish to be more than handmaidens. We are individuals who are capable of participating in the totality of church life." This bold letter did not pull punches, but drew on the language of RLDS scripture to make a robust case for the full inclusion and participation of women in the life of the church. While the letter did not ask for women's ordination specifically, it pointed to the need for it by making the argument that the current system of exclusion did not live up to the church's values as outlined in scripture. Thus, in their very first meeting, the group without a name, formed by consciousness-raising veterans, began to discuss how deep structural changes might be effected within their denomination. And now I'll turn it over to Nancy for the second part of this.
Okay, thank you, David. So we're on to where the RLDS Women's Caucus. The 1970s was awash in women's ordination debate in the United States and around the globe. RLDS women were aware of these developments. The minutes of a March 30th, 1976 meeting of the emerging RLDS feminist group noted that some objected to the name "a group without a name," as they thought it sounded like an underground organization. By this time, the group was informally calling itself the RLDS Women's Caucus. One participant declared, "We are a social movement," during the meeting, connecting the work of the group to other women's advocacy groups in other denominations. The RLDS Women's Caucus outlined a number of goals, as recorded in the minutes of the meeting, as you can see in this slide. The goals included educating, quote, "the church membership about the status of women in the church," emphasizing the ultimate value of persons regardless of sex, supporting group members struggling with not being valued by the church, and researching concepts related to the status of women in the church. And under this last goal, there were several comments and questions related to women in the priesthood. The minute taker recorded that the group should investigate, quote, "ways of getting at power without dealing with priesthood," and then asked, "Is there any power in the church structure other than priesthood?" Members of the RLDS Women's Caucus were aware of the difficulty of tackling the issue of women in ordination directly, and, as the previous letter demonstrated, preferred to address the low status of women in the church and the need to fix that instead of seeking ordination directly. In advance of the 1976 World Conference, the RLDS Women's Caucus requested space for a women's social and informational gathering as part of the conference, but were denied by church leaders. Instead, they rented space at Palmer Junior High School and planned to hold a gathering there. They asked church leaders if they could put up notices on the auditorium notice boards about the meeting but were again denied access. Marilou Goodyear recalled that Madeline Brunson suggested that they put their notices about the women's meeting in the women's bathrooms at World Conference, where priesthood leaders would not see them. Lois Brabrey remembered a large and successful gathering with more than 100 women in attendance. Though both men and women also showed up to protest the meeting and were asked to leave. At that meeting, RLDS feminists from across the United States planned to start affiliate organizations in California, Oregon, Washington, Iowa, Kansas, Florida, and Colorado, although most of the affiliated chapters did not materialize in the coming years. Aware becomes aware. By the end of the 1970s, the RLDS Women's Caucus was searching for a new name. Earlier notes from Marge Troe suggested that the group had considered, perhaps as a joke, Pandora's Organization for Women, or POW, but they did not go in that direction. Instead, they landed on the name AWARE, which stood for Awake, Worship, Action, Renewal, and Education. In doing so, the group signaled that they would continue the dual emphasis on consciousness raising and advocacy work. Unlike many Christian women's programming at the time, former Herald editor Barbara Howard, an aware participant, remembered that, quote, the classes that we had were not on how to make a better bed or how to cook a better meal. They were all about your mind and your gifts, close quote. One particular retreat featured a memorable speaker, Peggy Ann Way, who was an ordained woman in the United Church of Christ, or UCC. Howard remembers hearing a message from this speaker that encouraged her to, quote, be assertive, but also use your gifts. Find a place in the church where they will need your gifts. Get in there and use those gifts, because if you pull away, the church will never change, close quote. For the aware women, these consciousness-raising meetings were essential for their personal transformation. Howard also remembered that AWARE encouraged participants to advocate for women at the congregational level. She said that, quote, AWARE group kept pushing. In whatever congregation you were in, AWARE members were supposed to try and get up on that pulpit and say a prayer, read a scripture, or do something that didn't mean you had to be ordained to get up there in front of the people, close quote. Aware women, numbering no more than 30 to 40 at any given time, pursued the work of consciousness raising and advocacy training. The group did this through monthly meetings and yearly retreats. At these women-only gatherings, they circulated and discussed feminist books or short articles, shared reading lists on feminist theology, cribbed from the syllabi of college courses that they had taken or taught, organized support for local women running for public office, created action plans to advocate for equal pay for women who worked for the church. They planned conferences that explored more broadly women's issues in religion, and they wrote letters, like the one that you see in our slide, expressing their solidarity with Mormon feminist Sonia Johnson, a prominent excommunicated feminist in the LDS Church. Beyond their meetings, aware women joined ecumenical organizations like Church Women United. They founded and staffed a shelter for women who had been victims of domestic violence, the first of its kind in the Independence area. They created women-centered liturgy using inclusive language, and they ran retreats at which they preached and performed sacrament-like rituals without the sanction of ordination. Aware women and their allies challenged the hierarchical nature of priesthood itself, although they did so with varying ideas about the value of women's ordination for the church. As early as 1972, Carolyn Reiser summed up the feelings of some RLDS feminists who did not want women's ordination, since for them, quote, priesthood had lost any valid function it may have had and now exists as an authoritarian structure, fostering unquestioning, unthinking obedience to the voice of the priesthood as the final authority, close quote. More typical was the response of RLDS feminists who wanted a transformed, egalitarian priesthood, and, if that goal seemed remote, a church in their present that centered the capabilities of laity for ministry, with priesthood officiating only in sacraments. Some of the women in AWARE were married to men prominent in the RLDS leadership positions. However, many participants were rank and file churchwomen, consistent with how successful ordination movements typically involved a combination of elite and grassroots support. Ultimately, AWARE women not only advocated for women's ordination, but also practiced non-hierarchical models of leadership described in articles published by Courage. In 1979, RLDS Women's Commissioner and AWARE member Marjorie Troe represented the church at the National Board for Churchwomen United, an ecumenical organization that connected Troe to those who were doing similar kinds of advocacy work in other denominations. RLDS women became more involved with Churchwomen United at the local and national levels. Churchwomen United, too, had become a much more activist organization in the 1970s compared to its more apolitical stance in the previous decades. Consequently, RLDS women found their activism energized by their association with Churchwomen United. By the early 1980s, the campaign for women's ordination within the RLDS Church had spread throughout the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada. For example, women were being called to priesthood in local Australian and New Zealand congregations, but their calls were not approved by the RLDS First Presidency. Frustrated by the situation, Australian and New Zealand delegates at the 1980 World Conference proposed a solution, authorizing women's ordination in their local jurisdictions, even if it did not happen in the larger LDS Church. This resolution failed, unfortunately. In 1984, Sharon Welch, a longtime member of AWARE and newly hired assistant professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School, led an AWARE retreat at a Benedictine abbey in northern Missouri. By then, RLDS feminists had been advocating for more than a decade for goals that were congruent with the emerging women church groups in the Catholic Church. At the retreat, RLDS women tried to enact this vision, allowing all to participate in the serving of communion, a violation of common RLDS practices in which only priesthood served the sacrament. Feminist groups and other parts of the church had enacted this same transgressive ritual for several years, including in an all-women's congregation in Michigan. Though the church hierarchy had long identified revelation as the best path forward for women's ordination, no such revelation had been forthcoming from the First Presidency until the 1984 World Conference, when church leaders presented the long-awaited document. Some church members were jubilant. Becky Savage, who was present at the reading of the new revelation that became Section 156 of the Doctrine and Covenants, wrote, "I can confirm the overwhelming, stunned quiet that permeated the conference chamber when the document was read to the unordained delegates. The second most predominant emotion was joy, and for many, this elation continued for several months." Others, however, had more mixed responses. Marlene Kruger, who had worked in the music and women's departments, was overwhelmed and did not want additional church responsibilities. RLDS feminists who had been exploring the elimination of the patriarchal hierarchy in a women church model had a different critique. For them, women's ordination felt like a concession instead of a victory. Barbara Higdon, the president of Graceland College, reflected on her immediate response years later, wondering if she would accept a call to priesthood with integrity. Archivist Madeline Brunson likewise expressed ambivalence and wrote that she felt depressed that the hierarchical church structure would remain intact. So then, while the 1984 World Conference approved women's ordination, the first ordinations did not happen until November 17, 1985, when 100 ordinations took place, with hundreds following the next year. Susan Score reported that many women face local opposition, not unlike what took place in other denominations. Yet the growing number of women's ordinations made the denomination stand out among American churches, and this is a really important point. The RLDS priesthood statistics from 1996, and as reported in the Herald, showed that women made up about 27% of all priesthood in the global church. In comparison, in 1994, in the United Church of Christ, the United Church of Christ had the highest percentage of women clergy of any mainline Protestant denomination, at 25%, with many mainline Protestant denominations sitting at 10 to 12%. So the RLDS church's 27% was significant. In the almost 40 years since the first RLDS ordinations in 1985, the social significance of women's ordination came into sharper focus as denominations took women's ordination as a sign of which side a group took in America's culture wars. By the 1990s, America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, had retracted its policies that had allowed for women's ordination as senior pastors. Reflecting on such developments, Mark Chaves explained that American denominations often utilized women's ordination, quote, as symbolic display to the outside world, close quote, on their collective position toward liberalism within modernity. Quote, to resist gender equality, stated Chaves, was and is to resist that project of liberalism within modernity. While church leaders and scholars have expressed concerns over the number of those who left in the wake of women's ordination, David Howlett and I believe that the change to ordain women, saved the RLDS Church by allowing many more capable adults to join the ranks of church leadership at the local level and more broadly. Many RLDS women celebrated the victory of the 1984 decision, but others viewed it as this change as a concession to patriarchal hierarchy rather than a win for true equality. Today, 6 members of the Council of 12, the 12 Apostles, are women, as is one of the 3 members of the First Presidency. And now, I guess we've changed. We've had some updates since this, since we last gave this presentation, and now 2 of the presiding bishopric. No, just 1. Sorry. Women serve at all levels of church leadership throughout the global church. And many expect that, and this is, I guess, out of date. We now know that Stacey Cram will serve as our next prophet president of Community of Christ, and she is a woman. And we are excited about this finally coming about. So while this has been a big history lesson, I think that there are a few things that we can take away from this bigger story. And the first is that institutional change takes a lot of grassroots work over a sustained period of time. The acceptance of Section 156 of the Doctrine and Covenants brings about this change in 1984, but Australia and New Zealand mission centers asked for this change beginning in 1970. This is a 14-year gap. The second big takeaway here is that many of the women who were advocating for change were married to men at all levels of leadership. Male church leaders had good reason to listen to their wives. So thank you for attending this presentation, perhaps for the second time. And we now are willing to take questions. And so please type your questions in the Q&A. And then David, do you want to stop? Oh, I guess we want to keep that. Do you want to unmute yourself and maybe we can get you spotlighted as well?
And while we're working on spotlighting David, I would like to jump in and say thank you, David and Nancy, for sharing this fascinating history. So much we didn't know, so much yet to learn. But I bet a number of people in the audience probably recognize the names you shared tonight and likely had personal experiences with these movers and shakers in Community of Christ history. Honestly, I think we could have listened to you two all night long. So thank you again for carving out time on this Friday night to share this fascinating history.
Well, last time when we gave this talk, we had folks reach out to us and send us emails with stories. Those were fantastic. If you are listening right now and you have more stories, please reach out to us and tell us any of the related stories. I mean, we've already heard from people who are like, well, I was on this particular committee. I mean, we need to interview you. So yes. Please do reach out to us. Our email addresses, you can Google our names and find us at our institutions. But yeah, we would love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm afraid now we'll have to bring our wonderful evening program to a close. Thank you so much to our guest historians, Nancy Ross and David Howlett. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about Community of Christ's historic path towards women's ordination. We learned a lot tonight. Thank you. Also, a big thank you to Peter Smith and Lexi Frazier for their behind the scenes work and making it always look so easy. And lastly, we share to all of you, our dear friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We couldn't have programs like tonight's program without you. So thank you for your support. I encourage all of you to tune in on May 2nd as we welcome Everett Graffio to the Spring Lecture Series. Everett is our first storyteller in the new series, Your Story is Church History. And Everett best describes his life story as, quote, life is not a goal toward which we reach, but a response to a voice in our hearts and minds that sets us on a journey of discovery. Everett's personal path began in Iowa and it expanded across the globe to include living in places like French Polynesia and Hawaii. He had responsibilities for the Pacific Islands, Australia, the Philippines, and India mission centers. So I hope you all can swing back and join us the first Thursday in May to hear Everett Graffio's unique story as shared by the former presiding evangelist himself. Follow the link that Lexi just dropped into the chat to register for Everett's lecture, again happening on Thursday, May 2nd at 7 p.m. So until then, friends, keep reading your church history and have a good night.